Picture the position for a second. You have one of the largest training clusters on the planet, a competitor shipping every few weeks, and a model your own executives keep hinting at in public. What would it take for you to stop? Not stop everything. Stop one specific category of run, on purpose, and then publish the fact. Yesterday afternoon, OpenAI posted exactly that. They have temporarily paused reinforcement learning training on their latest models intended for deployment, pending new security, alignment, and monitoring requirements.
The scoping is the first thing I noticed. Reinforcement learning specifically, the post-training stage where you push a model toward being better at long, multi-step work. That's the phase on hold. Pre-training isn't mentioned. Research runs aren't mentioned. It's the runs headed for a product.
Right, and that distinction is going to get flattened everywhere today. So let's keep hold of it. Nobody said OpenAI stopped training. They said the reinforcement learning runs on deployment-bound models are paused while new requirements catch up. Here's where we're headed this morning. We start with this pause and the two very different explanations that came with it. Then an outside scorecard grading every lab on whether its control practices actually exist. After that, Claude running a protein design campaign with wet lab results. Then a governor signing data center rules on the same day somebody committed to 4.25 gigawatts next door. Anthropic's numbers and some new silicon.
Start with the two explanations because they don't say the same thing. Greg Brockman's version is that their confidence in safety sets the pace of deployment. That's a framing where the pause is a feature of a working process. Sam Altman's version, quote, model progress is now extremely rapid, and we always said we would take action if we felt that model capabilities were outstripping the pace of safety and alignment. That isn't the same sentence.
It really isn't. One describes a system holding, and the other describes a system being outrun. My read is that both are honest, and they're written for different audiences. Brockman is talking to people who need to believe the process works, and Altman is talking to people who would notice if he pretended nothing had changed. But if you only read one of them, you come away with a different company.
There's a third document under both of those, and it's the one I'd actually send someone. OpenAI published a post titled, Pacing Model Development in an Era of Cybercritical Capabilities. That title names the constraint. It isn't a general appeal to caution. It's cyber capability, models getting good enough at offensive security work that shipping them changes who can do what.
Which lines up with the reporting. Max Zeff wrote that Astra, the next frontier model, is held up on security and alignment work. There's also a Reddit summary circulating saying the models are showing, quote, various degrees of misalignment. That phrasing comes through a reported Altman quote rather than a document, so hold it loosely. What we have on the record is a pause, a stated reason, and a specific model that isn't out.
Then there's the number, which is the part I keep coming back to. Ethan Mollick flagged that roughly 20% of research inference compute is going to chain-of-thought monitoring. 20%. That's not a policy, it's a bill. You can't say that in public and then reallocate it back next quarter without somebody noticing the graph.
Say more about why that specific spend is the interesting one.
Because monitoring chains of thought means you are running a second model, or a second pass, over the reasoning traces of the first one, at scale, continuously. That is a real compute cost with no product on the other end of it. Every other safety commitment I've read this year was a document. This one shows up as capacity you didn't sell. That is checkable.
Helen Toner and Nathan Calvin both weighed in yesterday, and neither of them treated it as a victory lap. Toner's read is about the governance mechanics. A company pausing itself is a company demonstrating it has a mechanism, and the useful follow-up is who can pull that lever and under what conditions. Calvin was on the internal policy changes that came after the incident earlier this year.
The uncomfortable part is that a self-imposed pause is only as durable as the incentive behind it. Right now, the incentive points the same way as the safety story. A cyber-capable model that gets loose is a catastrophic business event, not just an ethical one. What happens the first time those two point in opposite directions is the thing none of us can see from here.
And it happens against a clock. If Astra is genuinely held, then for some number of weeks, the best externally available capability is frozen while everyone else keeps moving. That's a strange thing to volunteer for, and I don't think you volunteer for it over a hypothetical. Something in the evals was concrete enough to justify the cost of saying it in public.
Yeah, companies don't announce that their own product is late for reasons involving the word misalignment, unless the alternative was worse.
Now here's the timing. On the same day OpenAI says safety sets its pace, Stephen Adler's team at Guidelight published their first scorecard, grading frontier AI companies on whether they actually implement basic control practices. Adler's summary is blunt. Those practices are at most partially implemented everywhere, with major gaps at every company they scored.
With a caveat he puts right in the post, and I'd repeat it here. Quote, at least according to the public body of evidence. He is grading what companies disclose. He can't grade what happens inside the building. Somebody scoring badly might have excellent internal practice and terrible documentation.
Does that make the scorecard weaker or stronger?
Different, mostly. It's a disclosure index wearing a safety index's clothes. But disclosure is its own signal. If you won't write down what your control practices are, nobody outside can hold you to them later. And the whole architecture of self-regulation depends on a paper trail somebody can check. So a low score means something real. It just means something narrower than the headline.
Felix Binder picked it up overnight, and the responses were mostly people arguing about which practices belong on the list at all, which is a healthier fight than it sounds. Nathan Calvin's contribution went sideways into enterprise adoption, sandboxing, permissions, and the practical security work that decides whether an agentic system is safe to run inside a company. That's a different layer than the ones Guidelight grades.
Both layers are real and they need different instruments. Guidelight is asking whether the lab has a policy. Calvin is asking whether the customer's infrastructure survives contact with the thing the lab shipped. You can score perfectly on the first and still be handing people a tool that runs with far too many permissions on the other end.
Put the pause next to the scorecard, and you get an honest picture of where governance actually is. One company has demonstrated it can stop. An outside group finds that nobody, including that company, has fully implemented the practices they've all publicly endorsed. Those are compatible facts, and I think both are true today.
The version of this I want to see in 6 months is the same scorecard run twice, so you can see who moved. A single snapshot grades the labs. A second one grades the scorecard.
Different kind of story. Anthropic published results where Claude drove a protein design campaign end-to-end with wet lab validation. The number everybody is repeating is a 35% binder success rate against a 10 to 15% human baseline. That comparison is Anthropic's own, so attribute it that way. But the wet lab cart is what makes it more than a benchmark.
And then the researchers reading the actual method took the air out of the word autonomously, which is fair. Ravid Shwartz Ziv's accounting is that Claude orchestrated existing open-source tools, PX Design, RF Diffusion, Genie, and BoltzGen, from a roughly 30,000 token expert prompt, using around 12,500 H100 hours. Alex Pejsakovic read it the same way.
30,000 tokens of expert prompt is a document. That's someone who knows protein design writing down how to do protein design.
It is, and I think it's more interesting for that, not less. Nobody in this field was waiting for a language model to invent RF diffusion. They were waiting for something that could hold a whole campaign in view for long enough to reach a wet lab result. Pick the target, choose which specialist tool runs next, read the output, and decide what to try again. That's a scheduling and judgment problem, and it's exactly the kind of long-horizon work reinforcement learning is used to improve.
Which is a strange echo of the first segment, and I'm not going to build a cathedral on it, but the capability being paused at one lab and the capability being demonstrated at the other are the same capability. Long-running, tool-using, multi-step competence.
The compute number deserves a second look, too. 12,500 H100 hours isn't nothing, but it's also not a frontier training run. That's a spend a well-funded academic lab could contemplate. If the recipe is a very good prompt plus orchestration over open tools, the reproduction attempts start immediately, and we'll know inside a few months whether the 35% holds up in somebody else's hands.
That's the test I care about. A binder success rate published by the company whose model produced it is a claim. The same rate produced by a lab with no equity in the outcome is a result. Elsewhere yesterday, two things happened in adjacent states within hours of each other. Governor Josh Shapiro signed an executive order that he describes as the nation's strictest standards for AI data centers in Pennsylvania, and Nvidia confirmed it will back a SoftBank data center in Ohio, 4.25 gigawatts, reported at $105 billion.
The Ohio figure comes via a zero hedge post, so we don't have the filing in front of us. But take the gigawatts at face value for a second, because 4.25 gigawatts stops being a facilities question and becomes a state energy policy question. That's several large power plants worth of continuous draw for one campus.
What can a state standard actually gate at that scale?
Interconnection, water, land use, and who pays for the transmission upgrades. That last one is where the fights are, because if a campus needs new lines, somebody's ratepayers are usually on the hook, unless the agreement says otherwise. A siting standard that specifies cost allocation is doing something. One that specifies reporting requirements is doing considerably less.
Jeremiah Johnson's reaction was about the politics rather than the watts. There's a real backlash forming around data centers as a local issue, and it doesn't map cleanly onto existing political lines. People who agree on nothing else agree that they don't want the substation.
And the industry response so far has mostly been jobs numbers, which historically doesn't work on a siting fight. What changes those fights is the utility bill. If residential rates in a county move visibly after a campus comes online, that's the argument that wins, and no amount of announcement language competes with it.
So you get a governor writing rules in one state, while the largest single commitment in the region goes to the state next door. I don't think that's cause and effect on a one-day timescale. These deals take a year to assemble, but it is the mechanism people will expect to see, and Pennsylvania will now be watched for whether the standard costs it a project. Anthropic had a numbers day. Their risk report disclosed 3 unreleased internal models as of mid-July, Opus 5 and 2 others. The one that matters is the second, which scored 62.8% on a code evaluation, where Mythos 5 scores 50.3%. Reported second quarter revenue was $11.5 billion, roughly 14 times year over year.
Sit with 62.8 versus 50.3 for a moment. That gap isn't a rumor anymore, it's in a document. What you can buy today is measurably behind what exists inside the building, and the company said so itself in a risk filing. Every argument about capability overhang now has a number attached instead of a vibe.
And a mid-July timestamp, so it's already stale in the direction of the gap being larger. There's also a chart circulating on the Claude subreddit, sourced from the Wall Street Journal, putting Anthropic's revenue at roughly twice OpenAI's. That's a Reddit screenshot of a chart, so treat it as reported rather than verified.
The prediction market stuff I'd discount harder. People are pricing initial public offering odds of valuations above SpaceX, and that's a betting line, not a valuation. The arithmetic underneath is the interesting bit. A $2 trillion public company needs something like 59 to 79 billion in annual profit at normal multiples. Anthropic's own internal forecast is 190 to 200 billion in revenue by 2028.
Which requires the current growth rate to more or less continue for 2 more years in a market where token prices are falling. Those two facts are in tension, and nobody has explained how they resolve.
There's one more item in the same neighborhood that I found unexpectedly telling. Andy Hall posted a research role at Anthropic on the political economy of superintelligence. A company hiring an economist to study concentration of power is either taking the problem seriously or building the vocabulary it will use to defend itself later. Probably some of both.
Dario Amodei also pushed back publicly on Gavin Baker's characterization that he wants Anthropic to be the only private AI company, called it false, said he's concerned about economic concentration and wants competition. Take that at face value, and it's still a CEO whose company just posted 14 times growth, arguing against concentration, which is an awkward place to argue from. Quick pass-through hardware. Cerebras announced the CS-4, with claims aimed at serving models above 10 trillion parameters. Etched raised $700 million at a $21 billion valuation from Jane Street, Sequoia, and A16Z, among others, and shipped its first rack to Jane Street.
That last detail is the one I'd keep. A custom inference chip company delivering hardware to an investor who is also a customer is a real deployment with a real workload behind it. Trading firms have latency requirements that don't care about your marketing. Another benchmark chart would have told me nothing. A rack in a building tells me somebody signed for it.
And underneath the silicon, prices. Liz Thomas posted that average token cost fell from $2.07 per million on May 28th to $1.02, driven by OpenAI price cuts and cheap open models. There's a comparison going around claiming Grok 4.6 runs up to 5 times cheaper than GPT 5.6 Sol at matching benchmark scores.
Be careful with that average. It's an index across a shifting mix of models, so part of the decline is genuine price cuts, and part of it is people moving work onto cheaper models. Both are real economic facts, but only one of them is a price you can go get. If your workload is pinned to a specific frontier model, that halving may not have touched you at all.
2 tool items to close the section. Modular open-sourced the Mojo language at their conference, and Modular is part of Qualcomm now, so Mojo opens as a Qualcomm asset, which is a different bet than the one Modular originally pitched when it was billed as a Python superset. Read the license before calling it anything.
And the opposite end of the size range, Pranit released FX, a coding agent and command line tool written in Zig. The native binary is 6.3 mebibytes, with a claimed 10 microsecond cold start and single-digit megabytes of baseline memory. Those are the author's own benchmarks, but at a 10 microsecond start, you can put an agent inside a Git hook, or a build step, or a place where you'd never spawn a node process and wait.
There's a companion piece to that on Hacker News, incidentally. Somebody used Claude Code to teach macOS to natively print to an HP Laser 1008A, reverse engineered a driver, 109 points, and a long comment thread of people recognizing the genre. That is exactly the kind of small, annoying, previously not worth it work that gets done when the agent is cheap to invoke.
The frontier is protein binders and printer drivers on the same day from adjacent tools.
Last stretch, 4 talks from the AI Engineer channel published within a few hours of each other, and together they describe the serving layer, not the models, as the current constraint on real-time video. Reactor's pitch is world models delivered through an application programming interface with sub-100 millisecond edge routing. Their demos run at 16 frames per second. Getting to 30 needs multi-graphics processor parallelization and quantization.
The Lemon Slice talk has the specifics I liked best. To make an avatar interactive, they mask attention so the model can only see the past, no look ahead, because there is no future to look at when you're generating live. And they distill denoising from around 30 steps down to 1. 1 step, noise straight to a coherent frame. That's the whole latency story in a sentence.
They also claim they've eliminated noticeable drift across 8 to 16-hour uninterrupted streams. That's unverified, and it's a founder talking about his own system. But drift is the thing that has always killed continuous generation. So if it's true, it's the central claim in the talk.
The founder of URun put costs on it. Roughly $10 for 3 hours of continuous generation and $50 for 15 hours a day. He credits Helios, a distilled version of a 14 billion parameter model, running at about 100th the cost of the Frontier version. Over 40 models with real-time or long-horizon capability shipped this year by his count.
And the 4th talk is a Korean infrastructure engineer named Gabriel on training and serving K2. It has the least glamorous and most useful detail of the batch. They replace any node running above 78 degrees Celsius. They track tensor core utilization rather than graphics processor utilization because the standard metric lied to them. And their file system does 1.8 terabytes a second on read, so a full checkpoint completes in under 30 seconds.
The utilization detail is the one I'd tell people. Their cluster reported 100% graphics processor utilization while being badly used. That metric measures whether the chip is busy, not whether it's doing arithmetic you wanted. Anyone who has ever presented a green dashboard to a room and then found out the run was garbage knows that exact feeling.
One last item before we stop. MIT CSAIL published a finding that you can delete an individual artist from an image model's training data and the outputs don't measurably change, and that tracing a generated image back to specific training data is hard. They frame it as a problem for how copyright claims against models get argued.
It cuts both ways, though. The defense reads as, "Your work made no measurable difference to our model." That's a strange thing for a model owner to want on the record, because the same sentence says the individual contribution was fungible, and fungible inputs are usually cheap to replace. If it truly doesn't matter, license it and end the argument.
We have the CSAIL summary rather than the paper, so I won't characterize the method, but it sits next to a Hacker News thread from yesterday asking who owns the code, and both are circling the same difficulty. Attribution is becoming technically unprovable at exactly the moment the law needs it to be provable.
Which is going to be resolved by legislatures rather than by measurement, and legislatures are slower than the paper output.
One thing I'll check first, whether that 20% monitor and compute figure appears again in a later OpenAI disclosure, or whether it turns out to have been a one-quarter number quoted during a week when the company needed one. Adler's scorecard gives us a second instrument for the same question, and he said he intends to run it again.
And I want somebody outside Anthropic to try the protein campaign with their own 30,000 token prompt and 12,000 H100 hours. That reproduction either turns a company announcement into a method or it doesn't, and either answer is worth having.